Good morning, everybody. Today we are here to discuss some of our House Republican proposals for this next legislative session. You've heard from us on issues that we feel are important, throughout this past year, whether it dealt with juvenile justice or the police accountability reforms and the impacts of that on our residents, that there are certainly many other critical topics that we would like to see addressed. Certainly the affordability for our residents in the state of Connecticut in the wake of higher costs at the grocery store, the gas pumps. We also are concerned with the economic recovery. Connecticut is one of the slower states to recover on unemployment, and we would like to look at continued efforts to help relieve those pressures that are put not just on small businesses, but those jobs that are created by those small businesses. And then finally, as we saw last week and early part of this week, the debate over masks in schools is much more far-reaching in terms of addressing the impact that those masks have had on our children and COVID has had on our children over the last 2 years, making sure that the educational system continues to be propped up and the achievement gaps are being reduced. One of the themes, and some of my colleagues will talk about these issues, one of the issues that we certainly continue to see percolate is the corruption that yet again has hit the state of Connecticut and continues to hit the news cycle no matter how hard Democrats want to ignore it. And this culture, I think, began well before COVID, and the lack of transparency overshadowed the Capitol when we saw our buildings closed, our committees go into secret, and voting taking place without the ability to have public input to discuss some of that legislation that was being drafted. It began, I think, when we saw the Connecticut Partnership be formed with a historic nonprofit third-party entity that tax dollars were being funneled into. And that legislation had attempted to exempt it from the Freedom of Information that our caucus vehemently fought against, ran amendments that failed, that allowed that company to go into operating in secret, which ironically within a year collapsed under its own weight and was mired in litigation that none of us ever really knew the outcome because gag orders, I think, were put in place as a result of those settlements. And now we're faced with the recent news when the school construction agency was essentially moved out of the Department of Administrative Services and into the Office of Policy and Management, to our opposition and, in our opinion, in violation of state law that the governor had blessed and Democrats allowed to happen. It was no surprise to us that within a couple of years of that happening, we're seeing scandals arising out of that. And what was most disconcerting as of a couple of days ago is those scandals seem to have arisen very soon after that transfer, going back to 2020. And apparently the governor's office was made aware of that back then. And we're just finding out today that there were many more people that knew about it. And so finally, I also remind people of what happened with the no-bid test procurement process, where we saw a governor stand at a podium with his commissioner of public health, telling the public that they were deceived by a corporation, they had a contract, there were pictures of these test kits being put onto an airplane, and a day later only to find out that that information was not true, was disconcerting to us. And back then we had asked for an investigation, and each and every time, whether it was the Attorney General's office or other Democrat leaders, they continue to fluff this off as no big deal, and we'll look at it later. Even the governor yesterday said he would work with Republicans to address this issue. In part, we are here today to say that it's not good enough. If we have individuals that are involved in scandals and corruption that is leading throughout our quasi public agencies as well as the state government, that I don't think it behooves us to join arms and have the very people involved in these scandals actually do the investigation. One of the first pieces of our caucus proposals is to have an inspector general come in to an independent body to look at the fraud and abuse that we've seen in government. If Democrats are unwilling to open up this building, like every other building in the state of Connecticut, at the very least, they can appoint somebody to conduct these investigations to uncover what is actually occurring through the state of Connecticut. And I know the governor had proposed 3 additional positions in the auditor of public accounts. We would say that's not good enough. That is not what our auditors are used for, and we actually need a more forensic accounting that is not going to just look at how the money was spent, but how much of that money was spent and who benefited by that money. And so with that, I would like to turn the podium over to Tammy Zawistowski, who's going to discuss some of our additional policies revolving around transparency in government.
Good morning. Connecticut residents' confidence has been really shaken by some of the recent news stories that we've seen. And so it's really critical that the legislature sends a message that we are committed to transparency and good government. A few of our ideas I'd like to just mention to you. One is require quasi-public agencies to abide by the same transparency and ethics as standards as state agencies. Another, require certain quasi-public agencies to competitively bid contracts while also making them subject to the oversight of the Contracting Standards Board. Also require our Department of Administrative Services to make all contracts entered by the state that have not been subject to competitive bidding searchable on the internet. Also require the legislative committees of cognizance to review the state auditor reports and require state agencies to be more accountable for consistent failures and discrepancies. Require state auditors of public accounts to audit financially distressed municipalities that are under review by MARB, the Municipal Accountability Review Board, and require an accounting of all the governor's discretionary spending under the CARES Act and any other unappropriated federal funds that he was administered by his office. I just want to go ahead and get this to our finance ranking member.
Thank you very much, Tammy. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you all. And as Vin said, one of the issues that's a constant stressor and problem for all our residents in Connecticut is the question of affordability. So we have a number of proposals we would like to see move ahead, and with any luck, we'll have some bipartisan support on that. We'd like to repeal the highway use tax. We've seen our supply chain constrained. We've seen record increases in gas prices. This is not the time to be putting an extra tax on every single good that comes into the state of Connecticut. I will note that in OPM's presentation, the proposal for the match on those federal infrastructure dollars is bonding. It's not tolls, it's not a new tax. We don't need to make every single item that comes into Connecticut more expensive, so we would like to see that highway use tax repealed. The governor proposed increasing the property tax from $200 to $300. We propose this year, as we did last year, to restore that full $500 property tax credit for everyone, not just the elderly, not just those with children. Again, we know property tax is incredibly regressive and one of the greatest burdens on our residents. Let's bring back that full $500 tax credit as Governor Lamont promised during his campaign. We should index our state income tax brackets and deductions to inflation. If they had been so indexed, the $25,000 a couple see would be worth $47,000 now. Again, if your wages have gone up because of inflation, you shouldn't be pushed into a higher tax bracket because of that. Let's think of our residents and keep Connecticut affordable. And finally, we'd like to see 100% of IRA income for joint filers move to the federal AGA below 150,000 right now. Again, if you're retired, living on these incomes you get from that, don't move to Florida, don't move somewhere else. We should do more in Connecticut to make it possible for everyone to stay here. Representative Candelora touched on the need to keep our businesses competitive and the need to restore the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. We need to do that. We need to do that now. We have plenty of federal money that would fill that hole because individual businesses pay the cost of this. Because Connecticut's insolvent in its trust fund, we had to borrow from the federal government and pay interest on that. When we did that in 2008, in the financial recession, it took businesses 7 years to pay that money back. If you're spending a lot of money refilling that fund, where you had to lay off workers through no fault of your own, very often driven by government edict, we need to make you whole. Money that I have in my nonprofit, the Children's Museum, that Representative Candelora has, if we don't have to use that money to refill the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, we can hire more people. We can stimulate the economy. We should use that federal money to refill this fund. And now I'd like to hand over to Representative Zawistowski to talk about some more ideas we have to make Connecticut a better place to live.
Thank you, Representative Cheeseman. We also, for small businesses, and actually more important for the people who work for these small businesses, we need to encourage the use of additional apprentices. We want to expand the apprenticeship tax credit to trades that hire apprentices currently completing 2,000 hours of relevant job training. That's currently provided to businesses who register apprentices with 2 or 4 year programs and 4,000 to 8,000 hours. This would help more apprentices and their employers to be able to fill the jobs that we need at this point, and provide important job training to those who wish to join the trades. And I'd like to hand this back to Representative Candelora.
Thank you. And as we pointed out, we certainly know that families are facing a multitude of issues throughout COVID. Some was before COVID and certainly are exacerbated, whether it is dealing with mental health, substance abuse, and educational needs. So in addition to these proposals, we do have many other caucus ideas, but I wanted to point out a few that sort of address those areas. One that we championed last year was the expanding the crisis program, which is used by our 2 of our troops, our state police officers, providing training for de-escalation tactics, and for those individuals that may receive a mental health service call or a substance abuse call, that police officers are specifically trained in these areas. We would like that program expanded statewide. We also want to continue to push for the online learning platforms. That certainly could be a great alternative for children who are unable to go back to school for medical reasons, and also who might want to enhance their educational opportunities by taking courses in other districts that might not be offered in their own district. We also support, and I think it was in the governor's budget, the expansion of the mobile units that are helped for schools, especially those that don't have school-based health centers, to provide mental health services to our youth. We also propose, in the wake of the past 2 years, as we've said before, we don't believe that our educational needs were met throughout COVID, and I think decisions should have been done differently. One glaring issue that came to my mind is that the State Board of Education does not have any legislative appointments on that board. And I think that if legislative leaders could have appointments on the State Board of Education, not just have them all be gubernatorial appointments, we would have a more robust dialogue and input into our educational process, especially that this legislature passes so many laws that impact education, it certainly would be good to have voices that are appointed by someone other than just the governor. And then finally, a proposal that was also introduced by Senate Republicans is to look at expanding the Roberta Willis Scholarship Fund to allow for students to use that money for vocational schools, post-secondary vocational schools. One of the things that we've seen in COVID, and I think it was a statistic of over 200,000 bachelor degrees have been lost this year because of children unenrolling from schools, in part due to the pandemic. But as we see, certainly anecdotally, kids are looking for other opportunities for employment. And we believe that this is one area that we should continue to encourage. And so we do have our entire plan on the cthousegop.com website for any of you to take a look at. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
What are you proposing to do about calling for an investigation, obviously, into what's been happening with the school construction grants, what's been happening in the administration? Like, what is that going to look like?
So I think in the immediate future that the legislature certainly could put together its own committee of inquiry to look into this. I think every school construction project in the past and going forward needs to be looked at and reviewed. Certainly we have these other legislative ideas to bring more transparency to the process, but I think it would behoove us to attempt to restore faith in government by beginning this investigation into the process, how it happened, how we got here. Certainly we know there's a criminal investigation that will be ongoing, but I think we need a legislative one as well.
You mentioned that moving school construction from DAS to OPM violated state law. What law did?
So I believe there was a statute that put the school construction into the Department of Administrative Services. And so when that position was moved into OPM, it was in direct contradiction to that statute, and also it was budgeted that way. And so it was a unilateral decision made by the governor, signed off by the governor, that allowed that to happen. And so it not only did it happen under his watch, he was overseeing it throughout the entire process. And I think it was something that we were always critical of. And unfortunately, I think subsequently, Democrats did codify it and allow it to occur. But prior to that, it was done in violation of the budget and the statute.
What questions do you have for OPM Secretary McCall?
Well, I mean, I think generally we need to peel back all of these contracts, you know, whether it is school construction, test kits, the SEMA 4 contract. There's a lot of questions that have been raised. Certainly what is going on in the Port Authority in New London. I think this all has to do with these no-bid processes, the accusations of quid pro quo, and I think that our OPM secretary is certainly part of that, and she would have to answer those questions as well. You know, at a time when this building is completely shuttered, and I feel as if the minority party right now is the only voice pushing back on these issues, I think it's more important to begin an investigation. If Democrats want to continue to operate the way we are without transparency, then they need to put better processes in place to prevent the bad things that are going to happen because of the lack of transparency.
Do you have faith in her ability to lead OPM?
Well, I mean, she is a governor appointee, and so it's not my decision. I think it's the governor's decision. I certainly have concerns overall what I have seen out of this administration. And so for the governor to suggest that, you know, he would fire somebody conveniently who he was unable to fire is to me is a disingenuous way of dealing with the situation. You know, I don't care how you would have handled the state's attorney. I'm more concerned how you're going to handle the people in your own administration. And thus far, I'm not seeing a lot of proactivity coming out of this administration, especially when we know there was a memo dating back to July of 2020 that pointed out all of these problems. And to suggest that he can't recall whether or not he read that memo is pretty appalling.
Why are the auditors of public accounts not adequate? I mean, when the New
So
London
I-
thing happened, there were those hearings and there was that additional investigation by that.
So I certainly think that the auditors of public accounts provide a very important resource to us. But there's a few things the way they go about. They're planted in these agencies. A lot of the information that they get is through cooperation and interaction with those agencies. And they are sort of doing audits, not necessarily forensic audits. And they're independent from a legislative perspective. But I think that the investigations that need to occur may need to involve subpoena powers, and I think need some openness and transparency. The auditors work much slower. They issue their annual reports. They're typically ignored by the legislature. We've asked for public hearings on those reports, and they've fallen by the wayside. I'm concerned that the governor's suggestion is sort of a half-hearted attempt to create the appearance that they're going to conduct an investigation, that we all know setting it up that way through a budget process will take months and months and months, well beyond the November elections. We believe the investigation needs to occur today, not waiting for the legislature to pass legislation to do it.
So who would do the investigation? It's not clear to me. Independent people would come out, you'd hire somebody, how?
Well, dealing with this immediate issue, I think that is similar to the past where we saw the GAE committee come together to investigate emails that were sent around by a Republican governor. We saw this entire building come to a screeching halt and an investigation being conducted over those emails. We have accusations of millions of dollars flying out the door with no bid contracts. I would hope my Democrat colleagues would show the same interest in that money flying out the door as they did with a Republican governor, and they could model it the same way they did 10 years ago.
Can I ask an off-topic? So the governor just had a somewhat of a victory lap over at a nursing home in Bloomfield when the extension of the executive order gives visitors to nursing homes the ability to go in without being vaccinated or without being tested as of March 15th. I mean, are we there yet with our most vulnerable population?
Well, I mean, I think I struggle with anything that the governor is doing on any of this. I mean, we talked about our most vulnerable, and on the one hand, we're allowing individuals into nursing homes to visit, and we have continued to shut down schools. And the Office of Early Childhood has now come out with an edict that 5-year-olds and under still need to be masked because they're not vaccinated. So at the same time, we're masking a 3-year-old, which, if anyone's witnessed what that looks like, if you think you're protecting anybody from a virus by throwing that mask on a 3-year-old, you're out of your mind. That I just question what we are doing with the nursing homes. It's two complete departures. And so I would just say to the governor that he needs to be consistent in his position on science because it really does look like political science at this point.
And I mean, obviously, I know that you guys voted against the extension of the executive orders. I mean, is it that obviously the nursing home residents and the science says that older people are more vulnerable to this?
We did ask the DPH commissioner when that order first came out, I didn't really understand, you're allowing vaccinated people in without a negative test, but we all know vaccinated people can get the virus and carry the virus. So why aren't we just testing everybody in the nursing homes? And I think the response we received was, we just don't have enough tests. So, what is driving these decisions? I'm not sure. And I think that I have faith in our nursing homes to keep the patients safe. And I think that we should give them that ability, stop tying their hands. We're concerned with the number of nursing home staffers that may be quitting because of the vaccine mandate, which was now delayed to March 7th. They've only kicked the can down the road. They haven't solved the problem. And so I think we need a more open dialogue with our nursing homes to really understand what their issues are, to protect their patients, not just from the virus, but from being able to staff so that they could get the services that they need.
Ben, I have a question from Keith Thaneff of the Mirror. The Lamont administration says that because we are using ARPA dollars to help balance the next state budget, the U.S. Treasury rules bar us from ordering tax cuts worth more than 1% of the general fund, about $200 million.
Sure, I'll let Holly answer
Okay.
that question.
Would they have to be extended out over more than 1 year or 2 years?
I think one of the issues that was raised during our conversation with OPM yesterday, I believe 13 states are already, have lawsuits going forward with the federal government and the Treasury about that limitation. So I think as we move forward, that is certainly something worth bearing in mind.
Ask you, you obviously heard my previous question. Can I ask you, is the governor putting nursing home residents at risk?
I think that's a difficult question. And again, anecdote is not data. My dad's in an assisted living facility, and they test because they've had positive cases all the time. And we get emails, ex-associate tested. During 1 week, I saw 12 residents had tested positive for COVID. And if you're in assisted living, you're not young. Of course, these people are young. I'm not so young. From my knowledge of this, every single one of those residents who had all been triple vaccinated was absolutely fine. So I think there is so much in terms of if you've been vaccinated, if you've had your booster, even if you're elderly, you are much safer than you were before. So again, I think we defer to the nursing homes. It's obviously in their best interest to ensure every single resident is safe and healthy and maintains their existence. So do we need to supply more tests to them? Again, we see neighboring states who purchased millions of test kits. When we had we had pictures of the test kits coming in. So I think if anything, if we're serious about having kept our nursing home residents safe, we should have been ordering those test kits a year ago. Because let's face it, we saw the harm that was done to our nursing home residents when they couldn't see their loved ones for months on end. And even if you weren't suffering from COVID, the fact that only one family member could be with someone who was in extremis, who was dying, we could have made that so much simpler if we had the testing, if we had the ability to allow people to visit their loved ones safely.
Christine, I'm going to let State Representative Dr. Pettit.
I think the comparison is the kids versus the seniors. The seniors, as you note, are the highest risk people, so I think we should do as much as possible to protect them. As Representative Cheeseman noted, most of the folks in the homes have the 2 vaccinations and a booster, which does not completely protect them. So I think some masking, depending on the situation, is required, and testing at the front door, I think, is very reasonable. And I think you have to take it almost on a regional basis. If you're in a hot spot versus if you're in an area where 95% of people are vaccinated, the numbers are very low. I don't know if we'll get down to the numbers that I think we're talking about, trying to get below 10 per 100,000. I think the CDC has recommended like 1.4 cases per 100,000. I don't know in an endemic phase if we'll get below that. I think if we do, maybe it's a false positive, because the numbers will get so low that people stop testing, so you won't know who's positive and who's negative from very mild cases.
But is it hypocritical? I mean, he's saying, if you're a staff member at one of these nursing homes, you have to be boosted by March 7th. But on March 15th, even if you're not vaccinated but you're a visitor, you can come in our doors.
I think it's inconsistent. Certainly, your risk for death and hospitalization is here being unvaccinated. It drops to here with 1, it drops to here with 2, and drops to the lowest level with the boost. So I would recommend that the staff be boosted. I'd recommend that the visitors do the same, especially if they're taking a beeline from the front door to their loved one's bedside. They're putting their own loved one at the greatest risk. As we get into the warmer weather, you may be able to avoid some of those issues by visiting outside, but we're still in the winter, and so people are going to have to meet inside, and I think that creates increased risk for this group that is at significant risk. And the CDC has just released data that we may see, even with boosting, may see some waning of immunity some weeks to months later. So I think we should do as much as we can to protect that group.
All right, thank you all.